I think I have offended my entire audience now. Alright, let's go on this roller coaster ride. It's gonna come out at something like stop buying shit, but let's go off on a tangent first and see how we get there. So, I think about 2 weeks ago, I posted a mock-up in progress that was close to the finished mock-up across my social media and also in the video shorts here, and asked people to guess what sample library I'm showcasing. And there was a point to that. But let's listen to the finished mock-up first, and then I'll let you know what people guessed it was and what it actually was. Alright, so are you ready? Here's what the sample library actually is that I've used. Now, why this exercise? Let's get into it. I swear I wasn't trying to troll you. But there are 3 points I'm trying to make here. So the number 1 point here I'm trying to make is skill beats gear every time. Knowledge beats gear. Is this a perfect mock-up? No. Could I make a better mock-up with newer products? Yeah, of course. But this is a very decent, passable mock-up. And it's definitely better than, I don't know, 75 to 80% of what people send me with much newer products. Interestingly, this mock-up has shown me that we actually haven't come that far in sampling over the past 20 years, because this library was released about 20 years ago, at least the first version was. You know, 20 years of technological development, but sample libraries have not actually come that far. Like, whatever mock-up I would make with my newer libraries would not sound 20 years better. But so chances are that no matter what libraries you are currently using, they are probably better than this library. Naturally, I'm not digging at this library. I'm actually going to get into why this library is really brilliant. I actually like it. But anything you have is going to be, you know, better. It's going to have all these nice little perks that we've gotten used to with all the mic positions and the legatos and the legato script and the, you know, all the stuff, all the round robins, all the velocities. So anyone should be able to make a better mock-up of this than this. And yet, a lot of the stuff I'm hearing from both students, aspiring composers, demos people send to me sounds worse than this. Just to give you an idea what people guessed this was, the number 1 guess that I got through DMs and comments was Cinesamples. People thought this was the new Museo platform, me showcasing that. People literally thought this was the newest thing on the market, when it's actually one of the oldest things on the market. The second highest vote was VSL. The third highest vote was Spitfire. There were a couple of people that said East-West Hollywood Strings, so that's not that far off, though Hollywood Strings is way better than this. There were a couple of people that said it must be Garriton or, one of those really old libraries. So a couple of people actually heard that it was an old product. A couple of people also thought it was like the Contact Factory library. This is actually better than the Contact Factory library, though. Like there were a couple of random guesses. Some people guessed Note Performer, which is also not that far off. This is actually kind of the result that you would get with Note Performer, I think. At least what I've heard from Note Performer was kind of like this, like a decent sounding thing. Not as good as an actual mock-up with modern sample libraries, but decent to give you a good idea of, the composition. So there were a couple of people that were not that far off, like they could hear the lack of variety, they could hear that some things were off and that would not be in modern libraries, but the vast majority of people could not hear it. The vast majority of people thought it was like one of the most modern libraries by one of the biggest companies. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that we argue so much about sample libraries. We want there to be so much drama in what's better and what's not better, when the majority of people, I would argue, cannot actually hear the difference. Like if you thought this was Spitfire, you must have thought that the recording space was Air or Abbey Road. If you thought this was Cinesamples, then you must have thought that this recording space was Sony or Fox. If you thought this was VSL, you must have thought this recording space was the Synchron stage. The point I'm trying to make is, clearly we can't hear the difference. And I don't blame you, I can't hear the difference, and I've recorded in most of these spaces. I have been there in person and recorded there, and I do not hear the difference, because most recording halls are just big neutral spaces. They don't have a specific character, the outlier being Air, because Air just has a very specific characteristic. But other than that, all the other halls that sample libraries are recorded in usually sound very similar. They're just big recording halls that don't have a particular character. Like, I don't listen to a soundtrack album and go, oh yeah, that was recorded at Abbey Road by this engineer. I don't know that until I look it up. Likewise, I don't hear a difference between engineers. I'm sure there are differences, but they are all highly established, very successful, very skilled, very experienced engineers. And I've recorded with some of them, and I don't hear the difference. Like, they're all excellent at their job. And whatever they cook up is gonna sound marvelous. But I don't hear whether something was recorded by engineer X or engineer Y or engineer Z. And look, I'm sure there are some, engineers that can hear the difference, but I'm talking about the average person. I'm talking about the average person using these products, because this stuff is used as a selling point so much. We recorded in this particular space, or with this particular engineer, or these particular players, and I'm like, okay, but in a blind test, I'm pretty sure we would not know the difference. Like, I don't even know where this library was recorded. I was trying to find information on it, and I only found an old Sound on Sound article from 2006, I believe. It lists the engineer, but it only says it was recorded in a state-of-the-art concert hall. No idea where. If you know where, do let me know. I don't have the manual anymore because this was from a time when stuff still came in boxes and stuff with paper manuals. So I don't have that anymore, so I can't look it up. But yeah, I couldn't find that info anywhere. This was before the East-West Hall, so no idea. And it doesn't really matter. I also don't know what mic position this is. I'm assuming by the sound of it, some kind of tree situation, some kind of, I don't know. Could be a mixture of all kinds of mics, I don't know. It doesn't say, it's not labeled. And again, it doesn't matter because I have to use my ears to EQ and put reverb on it and work with it. So the tech specs don't necessarily matter because I can't change it anyway. There's no script, no transitions. One person actually pointed out that they can hear the fast transitions, and that's why they were guessing VSL, which is interesting to me because I actually also thought they were transitions. Because it sounds like it at times. And I went into the Kontakt backend and looked it up, and there are no legato samples, there's no script, so there cannot be transitions. I asked a friend of mine to look into his version of this, and he was like, yeah, no. But it was edited in such a smart way. I'll get into that later, but it was edited in such a way that it almost sounds like there are fast transitions. But yeah, there are none. On the other hand, since there are no legatos, there are also not unclean legatos. There are no legato bumps from the crossfades and bad volume balancing or out of tune transitions that are usually a dead giveaway of a sample library. So that actually might work in the favor of this library. In fact, I should try with some of my sample libraries to just turn off the legatos and maybe see if that actually makes the library better. But so this is a very simple library if you look at it in the back end. There's just like 2-3 round robins. There's like 2 velocities. There's not much going on. It's just really well edited and, it's really well done for what it is. And I was surprised by how good it is. And I think it's because there is less clutter going on. Because the more content there is in a library and the more stuff is going on and the more complicated the script is, the more flawed the product is going to be, because these things are still made by human beings. So the more variables there are, the more flaws there are going to be. I think having too much content actually creates too much inconsistency. So personally, I prefer simpler libraries, as you may have gathered from previous videos about my template and stuff. But so in the end, to get a decent mockup, it's really about volume balancing, about a proper arrangement, proper orchestration, EQing, reverb, and above all, knowing your gear. Know the product that you're using. Know the workarounds. Know how to get the best results. Know how to layer sounds. The rest doesn't really matter. I think I've only ever touched 2 orchestral sample libraries that I thought were completely unworkable, and that's because the basic sound of it, like the sampled sound, was bad. Like, it just sounded awful. And so no amount of EQing and reverb is going to cover that up if the basic recording of it was done badly. But instead of buying the next shiny thing with 30 mic positions and 10 different legato transitions and a complicated script and a million round robins and velocities and whatnot, try to make the stuff work that you already have. And maybe invest your money into where the problem actually lies. And you're going to have to identify that yourself. But it's probably not your gear, because we all have way too much stuff already. And really good stuff. So your problem might be mixing. Maybe your problem is arrangements, orchestration. I mean, whatever it is. Maybe you don't actually know what an orchestra should sound like, and therefore you have a hard time replicating it. I mean, there's so many different things that you can work on before you buy new gear. Because chances are, if you can't make the simpler product work, that new, shiny, more complicated thing isn't going to work for you either. To give you an example of myself doing exactly what I'm currently preaching not to do. Let's zoom in on me and look at how stupid I was. Unrelated to sound, a couple of months ago, I got a new camera. Like a really nice $850 camera. And I foolishly thought that's gonna make my picture quality better. It had all these complicated settings that I didn't know, so I was like, well, I'm just gonna leave it on the automatic settings, because that's gonna, probably choose the right stuff for me, right? And my picture didn't look that much better. It was easier to work with, easier to film in darker conditions without having grain, but overall my picture quality didn't increase. Like, it didn't look $800 better. And it also kind of constantly slightly overexposed my face, and it just wasn't, doing it. And so I asked my friend David Cadell to look at this and to look up my camera and just help me out. And he taught me about aperture and shutter speed and ISO and lighting, and he pointed me towards DaVinci Resolve and color correction and just all kinds of things. He basically had to explain things to me and send me down the rabbit hole of learning about these camera settings, because I actually had to set it up manually. And lo and behold, I went down that rabbit hole. Now I vaguely knew what everything meant and how to adjust it to get a more cinematic result. And my next set of videos looked so much better. It looked so cinematic. And people pointed out, the first thing everybody pointed out in the comments was, "Oh, did you get a new camera?" Well, here's the reveal. I got a new camera long before that. But it didn't serve me at all because I didn't know how to use it. I didn't have skill, I didn't have knowledge, and so I still had barely improved picture, despite having invested into really good gear. If you don't know how to use your gear, your gains are gonna be very small. Something I learned through a YouTube channel. Like, I cannot stress this enough. It's not gonna do you any favors if you have pro-level gear but don't know how to use it properly. Now, the second thing I want to talk about here is how amazing this product is despite the restrictions it was made under. Like, for my younger Gen Z audience that was born after the year 2000 or in the late 90s, there was a time when the world was very different before the digital age, or like when it was transitioning into the digital age. Like, flashback to a time when I was a teenager or preteen, and like the greatest thing that, you know, everybody was crazy about were flip phones. Flip phones. We thought it was the most amazing thing that you could go outside the house and have a phone conversation. Because previously that wasn't possible. Like, don't get me wrong, it was a blissful time before that, because you could just go outside as a kid with your friends, jump on your bike, and off you were. Nobody knew where you were. Like, your parents would just be like, they'll get hungry or tired at some point. Whichever comes first is gonna bring them back home. You might ask, but who supervised you? Absolutely nobody. It was a glorious time to grow up. There were also no cameras. Like, there were cameras, but not something that you had on you all the time, so there's no evidence of what we did. As long as you weren't brought home in a police car, you were fine. Like, no questions asked. And you know, around that time, internet was there. It was like dial-up. It was really bad. Like, so bad. You couldn't do much on it. And not every household had it either. It was not a good time for the internet. Most movies were still shot on film. I think the Star Wars prequels came out around that time, and they were the first, or some of the first movies ever shot on digital. Like, it was like a new thing. Sample libraries still came in boxes and like on DVDs, and you had to insert the DVDs one by one, and it took forever to install any sample library. It was, you know, it was what it was. Computers were kind of shitty and slow. Like, most households still had Windows computers. Apple was not really a thing at the I mean, they were a thing, but not something every household would have. The iPod had just been invented, so that kind of marked the turn of the tide. But it wasn't really a thing yet. We were still on Windows 2000 or Windows XP or something at the time. And those computers couldn't do much. They were very limited in RAM. RAM was also expensive. Hard drive space was expensive. SSDs didn't exist. CPU was slower, much slower. Everything was smaller, limited, and more expensive. So with that in mind, it was not the best time to try and make an orchestral sample library. Software sample library. Because obviously orchestral sample libraries existed, but on hardware samplers. But not, you know, not something you would put on a hard drive and then play through Contact, or at the time it would have been Compact. The content had to be so condensed to the bare minimum that computers could play, and whatever content was there had to be so good. It had to be so well edited and tuned, and just everything, the releases had to be clean, everything had to be 100% quiet, denoised, because you have so little content and so little variation, so whatever is there has to be close to perfect. And this library is so good at that. Everything's in tune, everything is edited so well. I mean, it's amazing. Everything is clean, there's no noises or anything. And to me, the most amazing thing, the loops are so good. If you watched my video on how to fix your contact patches, you might remember that I said in order to get like a good loop, you want your samples to be like 8 to 10 seconds long so that you can get a really long sustained loop. Or if you can't get a long loop, you can get a short loop, but at the end of the sample, so you still play through the whole long sample first before it starts to loop. They did that here. Like, all of these loops are so good. And the editing, I could leave everything at a pre-delay of 0 and everything lined up perfectly. And they also did this thing, I mentioned this earlier, where you almost feel like there are transitions. And apparently they did this thing where they recorded multiple sustains after one another, and they cut the sustains from, you can see there's something happening before the sample edit, before the sample start. And so they cut it in a really smart and consistent way that makes it seem like there was a transition. You also have some patches in here that can crossfade between the two dynamics. I mean, the dynamics are like forte in your face or like mezzo piano, kinda. I wish there was a third dynamic, because I think then this library would be actually quite killer. But so some patches can crossfade between the two. In other patches, the timbre is too different, so it doesn't really work, because you can like hear one sample fade out and the other one fade in, which is kind of weird. So in those cases, you kind of have to settle onto one dynamic and then just use CC11 and ride that volume like your life depends on it. And by the way, I'm going to link to that Sound on Sound article below. If you scroll to the bottom, you can see how composers at the time that were using this product, or like the platinum edition of it, this is only the gold edition, how composers at the time had to run this from like 6, 7, 8 computers simultaneously in order to play this library. A library that, with these patches, I have less than half a gigabyte of RAM loaded, and I'm playing it all locally from one computer. And it's not even half stressed. I mean, the platinum version, of course, had more content, but, you know, today, this library, you could run it from a laptop. Apparently, this library was also really expensive. Like, the platinum edition was like over $2,000 or something. Like, amazing. Amazing. And we're complaining about like a $200 or $300 library these days. Like, that's not what I paid when I bought this library in 2007. I bought it just before it was discontinued, because they switched to the Play Engine and had the East-West Hall and everything going. So I bought this on discount just as it was being discontinued. So I got it for really cheap. And they always had a student discount too, so I really appreciate that. And the third point I'm trying to make here is sometimes students reach out to me, or I give a guest lecture and students seem very worried that they don't have the latest of the latest. They seem very worried that they must invest more into their gear, or that, you know, they can't compete on the market because they don't have all the sample libraries. And I had that worry too. And this is kind of where I want to dive into what the sample library means to me, because this was my very first proper orchestral sample library ever. Like, people have been accusing me of hating East-West or something. I could not be more thankful to East-West as a company, because they opened that door for me. The only other thing I had at the time was the Kontakt factory library that came with Kontakt 3, Kontakt 2, I don't remember. Like, yeah, I'm not using their products anymore because I once, twice, 3 times, whatever, had a problem with the Play Engine, and that almost really messed things up for me because I was prepping stuff for a recording session at Abbey Road, and we almost delivered late because the Play Engine was acting up, both for me and my additional writer who was on a different system at the time. But it had the same bug for us, and it's just not an amount of stress that I need in my life. Didn't need that anxiety attack. So, you know, I abandoned that product. But I will be forever grateful to East West because not only they were one of the first companies to consistently offer educational discounts and massive discounts. And that's the only reason why it was possible for me to even buy this and to continue buying their products throughout my studies, because I could not afford anything else. I used the hell out of this product. I used this product to get into conservatory. I used it to graduate from conservatory. I used this to get admitted to both USC and UCLA. I used this product to get my first movie gigs. And funny story, this is also the product I used to get my job at Cinesamples. Yes, that's right. I got my job at Cinesamples by using East West samples. So I owe a lot to this product. Like, this paid for itself, okay? And I owe a lot to the people who made this, and I will be forever grateful that this was, that this was a thing. And I also remember how inspired I always was, like when I got Silk and when I got Raw and when I got Voices of Passion and Storm Drums too. Just how inspiring the sounds were, that they actually made me want to sit down and write something. And yeah, I won't forget that excitement. Like, it doesn't matter that I'm not using their products right now. Maybe I will again in the future, who knows. But those were my beginnings, and I'm not ever gonna forget that. I will forever be in debt with East West. Now, why am I telling this story? Why is this important? So many young folks are so worried because they don't have the latest of the latest. They don't have the latest sample libraries, they don't have that killer computer, they don't have the latest audio plugins, and they're worried they're not gonna be competitive. And that's simply not true. You could give me any DAW, a laptop, and this library, or any comparative library, and I could still work. I could still get the job done, and so can you. I mean, I got jobs with this, so clearly it works. If you have limited tools and limited funds, limited gear, that's not a deal breaker. You're just gonna have to work a little bit harder to make the stuff that you have work. But it'll actually benefit you in the long run, I think, because if you can make the worst products work, chances are by the time you get the really good stuff, you're gonna have an easier time making that work as well. Because you're forced to develop a lot of skills to work around the weaknesses of your gear. And I remember being mad during my studies because everyone had better gear than I did. So it kind of felt like I was, fighting with plastic knives in a gunfight. But in the long run, it turned out to not actually matter for my career, and it turned out to be highly educational as well. Like, I still managed to get a competitive sound and, write music and by making stuff work, I learned how to make a lot of other stuff work. And it's also made me very pragmatic about all the fancy extras, because all my classmates were paying so much money to have all this latest gear and to, have all this crazy stuff, and their markups didn't sound that much better than mine. Some of their markups actually sounded worse, even though they had the better stuff. And it also didn't make them more productive. Because, practice is gonna get you much further than a fancy product. So this should be the final message of this video. Don't be discouraged by not having the latest gear, and don't assume professionals always have the latest gear, because we really don't. We don't. We find what works for us, and then we stick with that. At least most of the time, until, something else revolutionary or that much better comes along, and then we might switch. But it's not necessarily in our nature to always have the latest fancy stuff and, adjust our entire workflow to that new thing. That's actually very counterproductive. So don't worry about gear, stop buying shit, and just practice. I think I have offended my entire audience now. But there you go. Have fun.